All right, all right, all right, all right. I'm so excited. Hi, everyone. Dr. Funke Apalabi Brown from Restful Sleep MD, and I'm so excited today to bring to you this IG Live that I'm going to be having with Melissa Doman, and it's really going to be incredible. We're going to be talking about sleep in children with special needs, which I think is such an important topic to discuss. So I am going to have Melissa come in connecting, so we should be seeing her coming in soon. Hey, how are you?
I'm great. How are you, Dr. Brown?
I'm so good. I'm so good. Even better now that I see you. It's so good
Yeah.
to have you. Oh my goodness. It's gonna be awesome. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for such a great intro.
So I am going to just, briefly introduce you, and I will not be doing it in, I will not be doing it justice. So I'll have you just do it again. But before we start, I want to, I told you I read a few, I watched a few YouTube videos on on IG Live because this is all, a learning curve for me. So
Oh,
I'm trying to,
no worries. No worries.
but I think it's going to be good.
Yeah.
All right, all right, all right. So, just by way of intro, um, Melissa is a sleep consultant for special needs families, and for families who've had it with sleepless nights and anxiety and stress-filled days, and also for families who the doctors are like, well, it is what it is, right? And so really Melissa helps children sleep better, particularly children with special needs, so that families can grow and thrive and use the sleep skills for years to come. And so the beautiful thing is Melissa has worked with all kinds of all spectrum of children with special needs. So with children with cerebral palsy and trisomy 21, autism, ADHD, and so, really, we're so excited just to talk about this because for those of you that follow me, this is also one of my passions. Children with neurodevelopmental conditions. Typically, a lot of the time, just with some of my interactions with sleep coaches and things, that's an area that gets a bit uncomfortable. Like, "Oh, what
Yeah.
do we do? How do we tailor this?" And so, when I found Melissa, I'm like, oh my goodness, my people, we definitely need to connect. So I'm just really excited that we finally made this happen.
Thank you. No, I
Yeah.
appreciate that. And I realized when, in my write-up in my bio, I give doctors a hard time. So I was like, oh, I just sent this to Dr. Brown.
It's okay. I love it. No, I love that you were just being authentic because you know what? It's a struggle even for
Yeah.
physicians sometimes. I mean, my field is really small,
Mm,
and so it's a unique perspective that I have. So I feel like I'm kind of that bridge where I feel we all sort of work together because if I
yeah.
needed to see every child with a sleep problem, with a behavioral sleep problem, it's not possible. I would need to
Yeah.
clone myself. So I think we just have this the way things work, whereby if there are medical conditions, if there are more complex issues, then
Of course.
it is that's where we kind of step in. So totally.
Yeah.
Anyway, just tell us a little bit more about yourself and how this came about and the work that you do.
Sure, absolutely. So I have worked with kids with special needs since 2009, so almost 12 years now. Uh,
Wow,
12 years, yeah.
that's incredible.
And and I, with my work with kids with special needs, and as a Doman method coach and as a child brain developmentalist, I with having the conversation over and over and over again in my office of, my kids being totally exhausted. Here I am trying to give them a treatment plan that can't be done at home just because they're not sleeping, and of course their parents aren't sleeping. And at a certain point, I decided that, enough was enough, and I had to find answers for those families. And that's when I found out about sleep training and just this as a coaching thing. And what I started to do was I started to implement that, with my families and with the kids that I was working with. And here these kids were getting loads of physical program and lots of sensory, great nutrition programs. Like, they should have been sleeping better. So once we put that behavioral part of it in there, things got better within weeks. And I realized that at that point, I was like, okay, there are so many kids with neurodevelopmental issues out there, and they may not be getting everything they need from a therapy and a stimulation standpoint, but they also really need that behavioral thing as well. So for every family that I work with, we don't just talk about sleep training and things like that. We have to talk about like those daytime activities to make sure that that brain balance is in there as well. And once all of those things are working together, that's when we start to really see success with sleep.
I think that's really fascinating. And I love that you mentioned that up front. Like, it's not just the sleep period, right? There are elements of this that's going on through the day that has its own manifestations during sleep. So when I also speak with families, one of the things I say is I cannot group this sleep issues, and this was something that was I learned during my training, into sort of the the medical sleep problems. Okay, does the child have sleep apnea? Does the child have severe reflux or asthma or things like that will fragment their sleep, or restless leg syndrome, where they can't fall asleep because they have that discomfort, right? So and then the second bucket is, do they have behavioral sleep problems, right? Not that they're badly behaved, they just have habits, right?
Of course,
right?
Exactly.
So, like the, needing, a parent there or something or the other, needing, someone to reassure them for the 100th time there's not a monster under the bed, or, a lot of that.
Yeah.
And then the third category is just sort of the issues that are present during the day that also have the nighttime manifestations. And that essentially is, the children that do have anxiety or do have autism or ADD or other neurodevelopmental conditions, where it's not suddenly like they develop sleep issues at night. They already have, some difficulties during the day, and then at night it's a whole different beast. So when you kind of move it that way, it kind of helps like, what are the things I need to focus on? And so I love the fact that you cannot then bring that blend of the neurodevelopmental conditions. How do we then customize behavioral approaches that can really be tailored to fit they and their family's needs?
Yeah, exactly. And one common issue that I see with a lot of my kids with sensory seeking, kind of tendencies is that, having mom or dad there with them to go to sleep, it's a little bit more than just the habit. There's actually like a tactile thing that they're looking for. So if we're just saying, okay, you're sleeping on your own, but we're not addressing that sensory seeking, we're not going to be successful with it. So, for my kids who have that kind of tendency, we have to put that kind of sensory play into the day. We have to put that stimulation in there so that they're less likely to need that tactile input at 2 a.m., which is, again, unfortunately very common for my kids. But, I've had plenty of parents who have tried the behavioral approach and they're like, it just didn't work. And then once we put that into place, it's a totally different ballgame at that point.
Yeah. And that's an awesome segue to my next question for you, which is just tell us, and for those of you just joining us, welcome. We're really excited to have this conversation. If you have any questions regarding sleep, behavioral sleep issues, sleep in children with neurodevelopmental conditions, please do pop them in in the comments. So what are some of those sleep problems that you tend to see in your practice?
Well, I would say that majority of the kids that I work with, have a little bit of everything going on. And I think for the special needs families out there watching this, they realize like, yeah, there's a bunch of a bunch of stuff happening. So, you know, I would say probably 80% of the children that I see have those maybe not so great sleep habits where they've kind of learned, okay, I need X, Y, and Z to go to sleep, right? But some of the other common things that I will see is especially for my children on the spectrum, with my children with sensory processing issues, something I come across a lot are incredibly long wake ups at night. So something about that 1 to 4 a.m. time where those areas of the brain that are keeping out that sensory input, just they kind of go on break. But at that point, if a child has any sensory issues, like they're going to be up and they'll be up for 2-3 hours. And I've had dozens and dozens and dozens of parents tell me, like, we will do all the things. We'll hold them, we'll rock them, we'll get the iPad, do snacks, do this, do that. And like nothing seems to work. And at that point, the system is kind of on override anyway. So, you know, that for a lot of families is very difficult to navigate. And I think many parents feel like they're the only ones who are seeing that with their kid. But again, for a lot of my kiddos with neurodevelopmental issues, like that 1 to 4 a.m. time is really tough. So, you know, big, long wake ups at night are very common. I don't know what's in the water or what, but I have a lot of kids right now dealing with very, very early morning wake ups. So that's also a very common issue for my special needs families.
Yeah, and I think those long awakenings are they're just so hard. They're such a, you know, and the families are exhausted. So the other piece I was going to ask, I know you mentioned is some of the sensory, incorporating some of those strategies. So how do you kind of integrate that? How do you integrate like some of the daytime therapies or mechanisms or things like that during the day? How do you then incorporate it to their nighttime routine or to some of the strategies you advise parents to do?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I always need to know is exactly how much therapy a child is doing. Like, for example, for some of my kids in ABA, they're getting like 25, 30 hours a day. There's only so much I can do because, again, we don't want to overstimulate things either. So it really depends on how much they're getting of the therapy, what therapies they're getting. And for some children, it could be, you know, really consistent daily, you know, walks and tactile stimulation. For some of my kids who are very sensitive to sound, so they'll wake very easily, I will have parents do many, like very short but frequent sessions of auditory stimulation during the day to help retrain that pathway. Like, oh, those 7 sounds are actually okay. There's nothing to be worried or concerned about. So, you know, it kind of depends, but I also don't want parents to feel like they have to do 25,000 different things just to have a perfect night's sleep. So, you know, I really start things off very basic of like, okay, let's maybe start putting this in certain things in the bedtime routine. Okay, when they're home from school, let's spend the first 15 minutes doing these 3 activities. So, it's, you know, it's a little bit of a balancing act. And it all kind of depends on how much a child is already doing, because, you know, for some of the things like physical activity, it's not just to burn off energy to go to sleep. For a lot of my kids, that's a very regular pattern of movement that the brain kind of needs to feel a little bit more organized and a bit more regulated. But again, one of the things that I will have parents track is exactly how much physical activity, how much therapy, because sometimes I can see on sleep logs, like, okay, when we go over 2 hours, sleep is really not good that night. So there's always a balance of things. Like we can't do too much. And, you know, I say that for the parents out there as well, who feel like, okay, my child is very hyperactive. We have to do 4 hours of physical activity. And that's not the case. You don't necessarily have to do that. It's just, you have to find the right activities for them.
Yeah. And you know, that's so true, because sometimes the thought is, if I wear them out enough, we'll
Yeah,
get we'll get them to sleep. And sometimes they may then become overtired and
exactly.
overstimulated. And so then you get a rebound effect where they're not able to sleep.
Exactly. And there is a little bit of reteaching there for some of my parents. Like, and it's not, it's just to look at it in a different way of like, yeah, maybe they're getting so hyperactive before bedtime because they should have been bed an hour earlier. Like they're done. They're toast. Uh,
Yeah.
so yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So one more question, and that's there's a question out here that says, does lack of sleep routine affect kids who are nonverbal from being verbal? So is there a difference? And I think that can also take us to a different segue, which is, how does the sleep routine that you recommend for children with neurodevelopmental conditions, how does it differ from typically developing children?
Sure. So the first thing to address the question of, sleep routine for children who are verbal and nonverbal. My approach is, regardless of where they are with regards to their speech abilities, from an understanding point of view, you have everything to gain and nothing to lose by saying, hey, you know what? Whatever I am saying, whatever we are doing, you understand. Even if there are gaps, the beauty of a bedtime routine or a sleep routine is that you do it consistently. You're creating that understanding. So it's, in that regard, it's really not any different if a child can talk their head off or if they can't. If anything, I will teach my parents, especially for older kids who are nonverbal, we want them to feel like their bedtime routine is their own thing. It's not just mom and dad dictating this is what we do. So I encourage my parents to give their children choices. And if they can't verbally say what they want, we'll do a very simple system of, hold the things up, hold two hands up, have a piece of paper with the choices. So that way they have a way to interact with that bedtime routine and really make it feel like their own thing. Because there's definitely places where we can give choices of what color PJs, what activity, what book, what song, blah, 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 blah. So you want to build that in as much as possible. So your child really feels like they're a part of it, and it really becomes their own thing. Now, I think probably the most different thing or different element with regards to a bedtime routine for a child with a neurodevelopmental issue is that I find majority of my kids need actually a longer bedtime routine. So, typically you might find on a blog or in a parenting book that like a bedtime routine should be 20 to 30 minutes, right? Now, for the children that I work with, that's our opportunity to make sure that all needs are met before bedtime. So that means that we have to start that bedtime routine earlier to make sure that, they're getting the tactile play they need. They're getting their massage. They're getting that last outlet for physical activity, or they're getting that last outlet to really start like pulling in the reins and getting them ready for that sleep. So if a child with a neurodevelopmental issue needs more time, it's okay, because they do have those kind of additional needs that need to be addressed. And once that is, one of the first things I think most of my families see is that it's a lot easier for their child actually to fall asleep. So even though it might have taken longer, they feel more settled, more calm, more relaxed. And especially for my kids who have had incredibly late bedtimes and we're working on an earlier one, when all of a sudden when you address all of their sensory needs and this and that, they're able to, this kid who went to sleep at 11 o'clock is all of a sudden going to bed at 8:30, and it's just because the brain's like, okay, we got it all. We got everything checked off the checklist. Okay. So it's very simple things that can make such a huge impact. And again, every routine is going to look a little bit different depending on what that child's needs are. But again, I think for that person who asked that question, like, don't hesitate to put together a bedtime routine that your child needs. Don't worry about the verbal output. Like there are going to be ways that you can get them involved and engaged in it. And yeah, and like I said, just making sure that you're addressing everything you need to. Your child's going to be much better off. They're going to have a much better night's sleep for sure.
Absolutely. I think what I would also add is, first of all, we're all creatures of habits.
Yeah.
And children, even with neurodevelopmental conditions, need that structure.
Absolutely.
They need that structure. But I love the fact that you mentioned, like, you can include some flexibility, help them make some choices where, even if it may take a little bit longer, really having that in place where they kind of can anticipate what's coming next.
Exactly.
Something else that I usually will recommend is, having the picture chart, right? So
yeah,
we're ticking that off.
Absolutely. Every single family that I work with, we design that bedtime routine checklist together with the words, with the picture. So there's no ifs and no questions about it. Like, this is what we're doing.
I know. And the kids, they love it. They love to be able to say, yes, I got the point for that. Now we washed our hands, we brush teeth, and it just really makes things a lot less tumultuous, especially in the evening when everyone is exhausted.
Yeah. And I think that for a lot of my families where they haven't had a routine, their biggest worry is, oh, my child's going to resist it. They don't want the routine. It's like, just give it 2-3 nights. Yeah. And 99% of the time, the kid's like, okay, all right, this is what we're doing now.
I know. And I would also say that even for non-sighted kids, having some kind of routine as well is helpful, because
for what kids? I'm sorry.
For non-sighted kids, so for kids who are blind or things like that. Because even though the external cues they need, like lights and things like that, they may not necessarily be able to perceive, but still there's still some cues that they can respond to that really help set their circadian rhythm. So things are just not free flowing, and so that's also really helpful. So yay for routine.
Yeah, exactly. And for a child who's not able to see, it doesn't mean the other pathways aren't necessarily working. Usually they're the stronger ones. So yeah, exactly. Having something like auditory in there, having something tactile or whatever, like it, irregardless if a child can see or not, like they're still going to benefit from a routine. Absolutely. Absolutely.
So another question I have is with, with those prolonged awakenings, usually what would be, first of all, maybe we could first tackle the really late sleep onset. So it's taking a long time to fall asleep. What are your thoughts on bedtime fading and things like that?
So with regards to bedtime, some kids I have found actually, they do tend to have a little bit of a night owl tendency. So, I think that's also another thing a lot of my families kind of balk at, like, okay, 7 o'clock, we've heard that before. Like, so there is a bit of an element of like trying to find what that right bedtime is for that child. But I think 1 out of every 30 kids do they need to go to bed at 10 o'clock? It's very, very seldom. Most of the time, making that bedtime much earlier we're going to take advantage of that like window of opportunity where the circadian rhythm is taking that nice long, like deep dip for the night. And that alone, I've seen that really help with those long nighttime wake ups. I mean, I have some kids where it's just like that one adjustment and that 3 hours just becomes 1 hour, like that. Or, maybe it's 2 short wake ups instead. And sometimes it does require like parents to kind of write it down and see what the trends are. And that can be really revealing too, of like, oh yeah, I see it's like consistently taking this much time to get to sleep. Maybe we adjust it that way. So yeah, I think like obviously earlier is always better, especially depending on how much activity or therapy a child's getting. But again, as always, every kid is a little bit different, and you have to sometimes experiment a little bit and see, okay, 15 minutes later, 15 minutes earlier, let's see what happens. Now, you had a question about bedtime fading as well, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so do you mean like the independence part of it, or actually like changing the schedule itself?
No, changing the schedule.
Okay.
I know, right?
Yeah. So, sometimes what I'll do is for my kids who are on a really late schedule, who are taking hours to go to sleep, one of the first things I do is just cut the difference. So if I have the idea of like, okay, maybe 7:38 is a good bedtime, but they're not getting to bed until 11, we may shoot for 8:30, 9 o'clock at first, and like kind of make up a little bit of that difference, see if we're getting in the right direction. And then from there, you take it in really small increments. And I have found over the years, like at first I would tell parents to make like 30-minute adjustments, but I kept consistently like missing the window. So once we did it by 15 minutes, that alone made a huge difference. Like just going smaller, taking a little bit more time to process that, and then going to that next 15 minutes later, earlier, it allowed us to get closer to that window without completely missing it. And I've learned over the years that a lot of my kids, their signs of tiredness or that window could literally be 3 minutes, and parents are going to miss it. Like it just happens. So by doing it in those smaller increments, it allows parents to like take that time to observe and see, okay, is this working? And if you have to go in the other direction, I mean, it's only 15, 30 minutes, right? Like it's a very gradual adjustments. It's little, but for a lot of my kids, they have a very sensitive time schedule. So you have to be flexible with it for sure.
Yep, that is so true. And, in some situations, I agree that, one of the things I usually will recommend is when you start the routine. So if you're going to shoot for a slightly later bedtime, you then don't want to extend the bedtime routine itself. So really starting the routine maybe a little bit earlier or a little bit later. And the 15-minute increments, I think, is a great idea, because they have this brief period when you really don't want to miss that window, and then it's gone, and then you now have this period where it's almost like it's just impossible to get them down. I would also mention that there are some situations where the child, you've done it all right, they're able to stay in bed, and they're just there. They're not disturbing anybody. They're just laying there. You're just like, go to sleep. And they could be up for hours.
Yeah, exactly. And it's actually like really rare for me to see that, in the sense that, most of the time that kid that takes like 2 hours to go to sleep, yeah, absolutely, we can make huge headway with it. But there are a small percentage of kids who they learn and they understand whatever time it is, I just need an hour to wind down myself, right? So it's seldom, I would say, like, get into a routine, find that right bedtime first. But there is that group of kids where, their habit is, okay, I just lie here in bed for 45 minutes, an hour, and then I fall asleep. And if you know that is your child, then, you have to just adjust that routine, that bedtime accordingly, so that you know that they're getting an adequate amount of sleep that night.
Yeah. And I think that's such a great point. I also, how about for those long midnight wake-ins, our favorite? What's your approach? So for some of the kids just lay there and they're just having conversations with themselves. That's just what it is. But some, are heading out of the room and they're ready to take on the day pretty much. So what are some, and one thing I would say again is we're just really being general. We don't know what you and your family is experiencing. So just take this as educational, because every family differs. So there's no necessarily cookie cutter way. So these are just more kind of like scenarios, for instance, so I just want people to have that at the back of their minds
Yeah.
about
Yeah,
this. But so
absolutely.
yeah, so what are
Absolutely.
some strategies that you've kind of seen help?
Mhm.
um
Okay, so I think, a few things we've already kind of talked about, and that
yeah,
is like finding that right bedtime routine, bedtime, having a good routine, and making sure that all needs are met during that daytime. It's not going to resolve it 100%. I get that.
yeah,
And the one thing I tell all my families is like, look, I'm not guaranteeing we're going to get your kids sleeping through the night. Like, there are just going to be those times where the brain's like, you know what? It's 2 a.m. I got to work on this now. Like, it is what it is.
yeah,
I think most parents that I work with are very understanding of that. And they realize like, yeah, my kid just, they have their own different rhythm and their own schedule, and that's okay. And, my first recommendation is that if your child is really keeping to themselves, they're not like constantly leaving out the room, or there's no worry or concern that they're going to get into something that they shouldn't. Sometimes the best approach is just they got to work through it. And again, that for me is a sign that the brain is processing, it's organizing things, and that is going to disrupt sleep. But one of the other tools that I will implement with my children is something called a bedtime routine reset, where basically at a certain determined time, parents will go in and they'll repeat a couple of things from their bedtime routine. And this is like that kind of neurological, like, hey, yoo-hoo, brain, you're supposed to be sleeping right now. And I would say that like maybe half the time it works in that exact way. Like the brain picks up, oh, wait a second, we're doing that massage. Oh, we're doing that bedtime book we heard a few hours ago. I should be sleeping. And it allows the child to get back to sleep. The other half of the time, though, it allows, especially for my kids who tend to get a bit more hyperactive or agitated during that time, it allows them to feel a little bit more calm, relaxed, especially for my older kids, they may not be able to communicate it, but what I have found over the years is that some children kind of inherently know they're not great sleepers yet, and they get themselves very worked up about not being able to sleep. So that little reset it provides a little bit of a distraction from, hey, I'm not getting this done. And by parents going in there and just giving them that little bit of interaction, it's like parents saying, hey, it's okay, this happens, it's all right, let's try to reset here and get ourselves back to sleep. So and just to kind of give you an example of this, I'm working with a child now who has been waking up for 3 hours every single night. Like the last couple nights with the reset, like we've chipped away at it a little bit, but with that reset, that 3 hour wake up in the last week has gone to an hour and a half, which, for
that's
him,
incredible.
yeah.
That's
Yeah.
incredible.
So it again, it may not always work. And some parents will tell me like, Melissa, if I go in there, that's going to be bad news. And
Yeah,
we tried a few times. If it doesn't work, then we know, okay, we just have to back off and let them work through it. But you shouldn't be worried about like if you go in there, if that's going to be too engaging. If anything, you're just saying to your child like, hey, I know you're struggling here. Let's reset a little bit and try it again. And that's okay.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And one of the things I'm going to also just interject and say is, as you're walking through this process, you're also thinking, could there be a medical condition? Is this something I
Exactly.
want to bring up with my pediatrician, especially for children with ADHD or autism? There's a high prevalence of restless leg syndrome, for instance. So you're really having those conversations with their pediatrician if you're seeing other things that's going on, because it may be the discomfort and they cannot sleep through that discomfort, right?
Yeah.
So, and then there's also the place eventually, if you've done, you've really followed, really good recommendations, and you're doing all the behavioral stuff and it's still not working, some children do need medications. Now, the problem is with medications, there are really no FDA approved medications for sleep in children. So that's really such an issue. Sometimes, especially with, again, children with various developmental conditions there, the melatonin production is abnormal. And so there's sometimes a place for melatonin, exogenous melatonin. And so that's also some option. But one of the things I always say is that it's not the magic pill. It can never be given in isolation. And I know most families are just like, listen, give me anything to put an end to it. There is, unfortunately, you may need to walk through some things with the aid of either melatonin or some other medication, a few other groups of medications that can be used. Again, that has to be done in consultation with your behavioral pediatrician or developmental pediatrician, or sometimes, psychiatrist and things like that, or a sleep physician. So those are just also some caveats to it as well. And I'm just going to take one last question. I just realized we were going to keep this nice and short, but I feel like we need like a part 2, 3, and 4. But there was one question about if you're switching the routine, if you're switching your current routine, how should it be done? Should you do earlier bedtime or change the order of the bedtime routine? I know we kind of mentioned that a little, but if you want to just clarify that.
Yeah. So that is actually, for most of my families, before we even start any kind of sleep training, that's the first change that we implement. And usually changing a bedtime routine or bed timings, we just go for it. We go straight off the bat. But as you mentioned before, Dr. Brown, like, you do want to have that visual checklist of like, okay, here is the new routine. Like, don't just say, hey, we're changing things up, and not have something there to orient your child, because they're going to be like, what are we doing? So I recommend that if you are going to make any changes to that bedtime routine, just write it up first. If your child needs visuals to go along with that, make sure you have that in place. And maybe you introduce it the day before to say like, hey, listen, like this is going to be our new bedtime routine. And that first night that you do it, you have to have that checklist there every single step of the way. Because again, it is a little bit of new habit learning for your child, and they need to know, wait, what comes next? What comes next? What comes next? So it's, usually a bedtime routine, it's not going to be like a huge monumental shift. There might be like a few nights of readjustment, but it's, usually that goes pretty smoothly.
Yep. That is so true. So this has been a great conversation.
Thank you.
Someone just said here, sleep is so important for our health, mood, and brain development. So even in our kids with special needs, really, we want them to have great daytime. And so focusing on prioritizing their sleep is really important. And yes, visuals, I think we talked about the visuals are really helpful. I think that's one big takeaway just from this conversation. So this has really been so good, Melissa. Any final words, including where we can find you and how people can work with you and stuff?
Absolutely. So I think the first thing I just want to quickly say is that, I recognize that for a lot of parents out there, you've probably been told that there's not a whole heck of a lot that you can do with your child's sleep. There are some people who say like, oh, it's just part of the diagnosis or whatever, like just saddle up and get ready for it. But, I've worked with now several hundred kids over the last 5 years, and I really feel strongly like every child has the potential to have a great night's rest. It's just a matter of finding what are the right tools for them and coming up with that toolbox for them. So if you are in a very, if you're in a place of like, we've tried everything, we don't know what to do next, like, is this ever going to get better? There's always something else that can be done. Okay. So don't lose heart. It can get better. And if you ever have any questions for me, if you want to learn more, my Instagram handle is Special Needs Sleep Coach. And there I do an IG live every Thursday with different tips. There's all sorts of things coming up there, including information about how I work with families and everything. So feel free to give me a follow, and look forward to seeing you there.
Awesome. Well, this has been incredible, and I hope this has added value to you and your sleep as well as your child's, right? Because when kids sleep better, their parents sleep better, and that's one of the things
Absolutely.
that I've been so passionate about empowering, especially busy moms on. And so, definitely follow Melissa, special needs sleep coach, and just get all those great tips. And for me as well, just do continue to follow as I bring you valuable information to help you sleep better and help your kids sleep better as well. So thanks. Thanks,
Thank you
everyone.
so
Thanks
much,
for
CJ.
joining.
Thank you.
All right.
Take
Take
care.
care.
Bye bye.
Bye.